Welcome to Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg, and my co-host is Vicki Nichols-Goldstein.
Welcome, everyone.
And today we're pleased to be talking with our friend Marc Yaggi, Chief Executive Officer of the Waterkeeper Alliance, the world's largest nonprofit organization focused on the protection and preservation of clean water. With over 300 local boat-based keepers now in 47 countries, with scientists, litigators, and lawsuits, Waterkeeper's been at the forefront of a global citizens' battle to protect our waters, be they fresh, salty, or brackish. Marc has spent more than 2 decades working for the organization, going back to its headwaters group, the Hudson River Keeper, where he worked to protect the Catskills, an upstate watershed that provides New York City's drinking water. But before we work our way into those depths, let me ask you, Marc, what was your early experience with the ocean or other wild body of water?
First of all, hi, David and Vicki. It's such a pleasure to speak with you. You guys are doing such amazing work, and I'm honored to be here with you. My deep connection to water, I think probably like a lot of us in this space, started as a kid. And I grew up in the Susquehanna River watershed in Pennsylvania, so I was landlocked. Although I'd probably bet that I might have been the only kid in my town that was regularly devouring surfing magazines. I always had an obsession with water and the ocean. And, despite being landlocked, my world was a water world. I could step outside my back door and walk for miles. When I was a boy, I had a golden retriever named Ben, and Ben swam and fished with me in creeks, rivers, ponds, and lakes from April to October at least. We were there after school on weekends, every day in the summer. It was, being in, on, and around water was freedom and happiness. And we also made frequent trips as a family to my aunt's cabin on a river, and I would go there and again swim, skip rocks, fish. That's where it all began. And we had some trips to the beach, but I really started spending a lot more time around salt water after I moved to New York 30 years ago. I was just out swimming the Atlantic a few days ago, and we'll be fishing in Long Island Sound this weekend. So as a family, we just love to get out into salt water as much as we can, fresh water too.
Those are my natal waters, New York, and most people don't appreciate 80% of the cities off the continental mainland, surrounded by rivers and the New York Bight. And so what brought you to New York? Was that where you got your law degree or what?
It is where I got my law degree. When I was enjoying that whole water experience as a kid, and I kind of assumed that everybody else shared those same experiences. And as I got a little bit older and learned more and realized that not everybody can go down to their local waterway and jump in and have a swim or get a cool glass of drinking water without fear, with it being free of toxic chemicals, and just seemed like a really big injustice. And I geared towards going for environmental law. And so that's how ultimately I ended up at Waterkeeper Alliance. I got the start of the Waterkeeper movement really in the 1990s when I was a law student at Pace Law, which is now the Elizabeth Haub School of Law. They have an environmental litigation clinic. And when I was there, Hudson River Keeper was the primary client. And so every student, when you come in, I was a second year student when I started, you're handed 4 or 5 lawsuits and told to go ahead and win these. And those lawsuits could be at any stage from investigation to being in court to a settlement negotiation. And it was a really pivotal learning and life experience. And I was really inspired by the grassroots model that Hudson River Keeper had made. And at that time, that model was only happening on a few waterways around the United States. And so after law school, I went to had a couple great years at the Environmental Law Institute, and then was offered a role running Hudson River Keeper's program to protect New York City's drinking water supply, as you mentioned earlier.
So the Waterkeeper has a really fascinating history. And maybe you could take us back to before New York and the harbors were back when they were fresh and clean, and you could fish them, and there was lots of oysters. And then we had all of these terrible things happen, whether or not it was oil in the rivers or paints from cars. But tell us that story so we can get a vision of what New York was like prior to, and then what initiated the activism of people to make it better.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was listening to your episode that you recently had when you had Chad, our friend over at Surfrider, on, and his organizational origin story had, struck a similar chord with me, because he was talking about surfers getting fed up being out swimming or surfing in sewage and other pollutants. And, it was a similar thing, because this was fishermen being fed up and standing up and taking action. Basically, as you mentioned, Vicki, in the 1800s, a lot of people don't know this, but New York City was the oyster capital of the world. There were like 250 square miles of oyster beds, and they were considered to be some of the best in the world. That people were eating like 1 million oysters a day. You buy them off of carts in the street like you do hot dogs today. But unfortunately, we didn't treat our natural resources properly. There was all the raw sewage going into the harbor, and we weren't putting the shells back in the harbor, and all sorts of other problems. And before long, in the 1920s, the city had to shut down the oyster beds. And I always think about that as kind of symboling the decline of the New York Harbor and the Hudson River, because it just got worse through the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And by the 1960s, the river was nearly dead, and it was the laughing stock of late night TV. It was people would say, we don't go near the river. We would never go near the river. And there were a group of blue collar recreational commercial fishermen, though, that had been fishing it for generations, and it had been a really rich historical fishing past. And a lot of them came back from some of the wars. A lot of them were Marines and other armed services, and they came back and found that this river that they had learned their trade on and they had such a passion for was nearly dead. And they organized and got together in 1966 in a Veteran of Foreign Wars hall. And some of them actually said, they knew there was a problem with the river, but they didn't know how to fix it. And they were understandably upset and enraged. Some of them said, well, we should stick a mattress up the pipe of Penn Central Railroad because it was discharging millions of gallons of oil into the river. It was blackening the beaches and making the fish taste like diesel fuel. And so, and other ones said, no, we should light a match to the oil and blow the place up and all these other things. But one of them, one of our original founders, Bob Boyle, who had been an outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated, had done some research and found that the Rivers and Harbors Act from the 1800s, which was a navigational statute. And he realized that a lot of the pollution happening on the Hudson was a violation of that act. And so he stood up in the middle of that meeting and he said, we shouldn't be breaking the law. We should be enforcing the law. And he got those fishermen to galvanize around his idea of going out and patrolling the river, looking for pollution problems and holding the polluters accountable for cleaning up their mess. And they started Hudson Riverkeeper to do that work, and today the Hudson's teeming with life again, and people are now flocking to the river instead of fleeing from it like they were before.
And how did the revival of the Hudson with the Hudson Riverkeeper and all those efforts evolve into the national and now global Waterkeeper Alliance?
Yeah, it progressed over time. And I always like to think one of the pivotal moments was when John Cronin, the first full-time Hudson Riverkeeper, caught ExxonMobil in the river discharging petrochemicals from the hull of its ship. And after they did some research, they had realized that Exxon had been coming up from Aruba and offloading its product in the Jersey ports, and then coming up into the Hudson, discharging what was left over so they could go up past the salt line, fill their tanker up with fresh water to take back to fill up the swimming pools and things in, water deprived Aruba. And that case garnered a lot of media attention. And I think that media attention drew people to say, I want to do that on my waterway. We want to protect our local community. And that's when we started seeing more groups get started, and it just sort of piled on after that. What was really groundbreaking, though, was the Clean Water Act of 1972, because it created a citizen suit provision. And, any one of us can bring a polluter to justice under the Clean Water Act if government's not going to do its job. And so it was almost like, we haven't seen a lot of really great progress out of Congress in a long time, but in 1972, it was almost like they had a little crystal ball and could foresee Citizens United and the sort of corruption of agencies, in dealing with polluters.
I think after the Hudson Riverkeeper in 1999, when Waterkeeper Alliance was founded, its two principles were have a boat and be willing to sue polluters. Is that sort of the same principle today?
Generally, we have quality standards. Everything's very much grassroots and bottoms up with the organization, but for trademark protection and branding, we have licensing standards that the groups all agree to, and even that's bottoms up because they created them. But they do require you to have a patrol vessel and to be willing to advocate for enforcement of environmental laws, using litigation where appropriate and possible it's a little more complicated when you move into a lot of other countries where you may not have that same ability to bring litigation, but you can use other mechanisms to try to ensure that the law is enforced.
So, in the realm of water politics, whether or not it's freshwater politics or ocean politics, we know Waterkeeper has had numerous challenges. But I'm really curious about what some of the most intense challenges and successes that you have seen since you've been there.
I'd like to think about some of the seminal or some of the really important cases I've seen, especially ones that have been brought by our waterkeeper organizations. You know, in Atlanta in the 1990s, our Chattahoochee Riverkeeper filed a Clean Water Act lawsuit against the city to ultimately to force officials to reduce thousands of spills of untreated sewage because they hadn't been repairing or upgrading their aging infrastructure, and it had been long neglected. They settled that case in 1997, and it led to $2 billion worth of investment into overhauling the city's storm and sewer systems. And
what was the city?
Atlanta. And following that lawsuit, the average E. coli levels in the river were 80% lower than what they had been before. And there's other ones, there's a lot of other examples out in California where y'all are, San Diego Coastkeeper. Well, I'll say where David is at the moment. San Diego Coastkeeper negotiated a Clean Water Act settlement with the city to secure a massive wastewater recycling project. And that will significantly reduce polluted discharges to the ocean, and also providing up to about 50% of the city's potable water supply. And that's something around I believe it was about 83 million gallons per day through recycling. And, you're well familiar, I'm sure, of the freshwater drinking water challenges in the West. And so I think that's a really important step that was taken there. There've been so many. Our waterkeeper in Charleston, our Charleston waterkeeper, not too long ago, I think it was 2020 or 21, they were finding plastic pellets or nurdles throughout their local waterways and beaches. And they were able to use the Clean Water Act against a resin packaging company to get a settlement with them that included improved containment measures to prevent future spills, as well as the creation of $1 million fund to benefit the quality and health of Charleston Harbor. There's just an abundance of different inspiring stories that keep me going in all of these different locations, and those are just in the U.S. You can go outside the U.S. and there's some really amazing stories and victories out there, and under oftentimes much more challenging circumstances. In 2006, I just left Hudson Riverkeeper to go to work at Waterkeeper Alliance, and my boss, he asked me if I wanted to go to Senegal because there was a group that wanted to start a waterkeeper there. So I went over there, and it was a soccer club. It was a football club. The community was about 40,000 people. Han Bay, it's just outside the capital city of Dakar. 40,000 people with no sanitation service, myriad diseases. The community kind of broken up by football clubs, and this one football club was called ASC Iraq. And they had been active on social issues in the community, teaching about hygiene, HIV, AIDS, and other issues. And they really wanted to restore their bay to its former glory, but they weren't having success. One of the villagers had moved to Toronto, and he learned about our waterkeepers up in Canada. And when he went back to visit the village, he said, maybe we should start a waterkeeper to try to fix our bay. That's how I ended up there. And it was the most polluted place I had been to at the time, and still is in the top two, probably. So if I'm looking out at the bay, there's on the right side of me, there's a 10-foot wide, 20 feet deep, open canal of raw sewage coming from the capital city of Dakar, going right next to the villagers' homes, through the fish market into the bay. There's a pipe from a Libyan oil facility discharging petrochemicals right underneath the village chief's home into the bay, and a meat rendering plant discharging not this noxious brown liquid into the bay. And then, of course, there's no sanitation service. So when everyone's done cooking and cleaning, everything goes down and put on the beach and is dumped on the beach. And so the beach was just covered with food waste, household waste, algae, and flies, and it smelled horrible. And I spent a week with these guys and was really inspired by them. But I said, I don't really know how I'm not sure how we're going to add value to, because at this point we don't have any waterkeepers in Africa. I don't have anybody who speaks Wolof or French on my team. And I'm just not, I want to make sure that we can help, we can be of value and support you. And their leader, Mbeke, said, look, you guys have an international brand that'll give us credibility. He said this through an interpreter. He said, I'm going to learn English, and I'm going to go to all of your conferences and your summits, and I'm going to learn from the other people in the network of how what they've done in their community. I'm going to come back and do that here. Time went by. I'll make this long story short. And that was 2006. But 2014, I happened to be in Nepal working with some groups there. And when I opened up my laptop at night, I saw this article about how Waterkeeper had been instrumental in convincing the government of Senegal and 3 European institutions to commit $68 million to clean up Han Bay.
Wow.
That now has turned into a $130 million cleanup project that includes 17 local towns and cities. And when it's done, it'll be the largest clean water project in all of Senegal, and it'll impact nearly 500,000 Senegalese citizens. And it all started from a football club that wanted to clean up its bay. The work with the groups outside the US can be incredibly inspiring and also really challenging, because you've got different languages, different cultures, and also different legal and political frameworks. And on top of that, we've got to be very careful too, because depending on the country, the threats to personal safety can be considerably more widespread and pervasive than here in the United States.
The U.S. has laws, but they're not always enforced. And now we have a Supreme Court that just gutted the wetland provisions of the Clean Water Act, which is very basic to a lot of what you do. How's that going to impact waterkeepers and their specific cases where local waterkeepers have to deal with this new crackdown?
Yeah, when we're still navigating that, it's a really disastrous decision from the Supreme Court. They dramatically curtailed the scope of the waters protected by the Clean Water Act, essentially saying, wetlands are not protected under the act unless there is a direct surface connection between the wetland and a navigable, a relatively permanent navigable water body. And it's immediately resulted in the loss of federal protection for looking at about roughly half the wetlands acreage in the United States. And, after that decision, our advocacy team really parsed through it, and they hosted a roundtable with our waterkeepers to get a deep dive into the case and its implications and options. And the ideal solution is something that we need anyways, which is to amend the Clean Water Act to really remove references to navigability and broadly redefine what is a water in the United States, something that's science-based. Clearly the Supreme Court wasn't basing anything on science. And, we've been working with partners on a proposed bill, but given the realities of Congress right now, it might not be something that's going to happen anytime soon, but we plan to be ready for it. In the meantime, the best immediate strategy is to kind of work with some of the groups on state legislation and state regulations. But even then, you run into places, I think, in North Carolina, where they've set it so that they're not going to do anything that's more stringent than what's covered federally. So, that's going to be hard to figure out how to solve that.
Water quality, climate change, sea level rise, pollution, it's all coming more so in a different framework. So different strategies will be necessary. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm glad you made that point, because I think there's a growing awareness with people that climate change is a water issue, or climate change is a water risk issue even. And, if you ask people how, climate change impacts manifest themselves, they're going to say things like you said: sea level rise, flooding, drought, ocean acidification, all of those things are water. We don't have the tools here in the US to effectively address them. We know what needs to be done, but there aren't a lot of legal tools, and they seem to keep eroding them from time to time, right? And so it's a real challenge, but it factors into, we have 3 advocacy campaigns, and all 3 of them touch on, have a climate aspect to them. One of the primary ones being climate and safe energy, which is when we're dealing with issues around offshore drilling and, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, whether it's any part of the fossil fuel life cycle, which is bad for waters and climate, right? From extraction to transportation to, combustion and disposal. And so trying to, crack at them through that campaign is one of the big areas we work.
And what are your 2 other campaigns?
Pure Farms, Pure Waters, which deals with the impact from industrial agriculture and works to promote more sustainable agricultural practices. And then Clean Water Defense, which is really focused more on fortifying, defending, and enforcing clean water laws and policies. Right now, there are about 320 waterkeepers in 47 countries. on 6 continents. They're patrolling and protecting a little under 3 million square miles of watershed. And to become a waterkeeper, it's important to have a passion for your waterway, be wanting to be be willing to be out there and patrol and be a spokesperson and speak up for, be the eyes, ears, and voice of that waterway and the community that relies on it for swimming or drinking or fishing. And everything else will work with you on the whole proposal process.
So now Waterkeeper was founded in 1999 by Bobby Kennedy Jr. and he was a very good environmental attorney in building the organization. Today, he's running for president as a Democrat, kind of controversial figure. What's Bobby's relationship to Waterkeeper today?
Bobby's no longer president of Waterkeeper Alliance, and he stepped down in 2020. He's very supportive of us, and he was instrumental, in both being a founder of Waterkeeper Alliance, but also he was really instrumental in what those fishermen did in terms of turning the Hudson from a nearly dead river into an icon of ecosystem revitalization, and also then inspiring advocates all over the globe to protect their waterway and to hold polluters accountable.
I know locally, I live no longer in San Diego, in Richmond, California, which is a predominantly low-income community of color, and our San Francisco Baykeeper has been a strong ally and supporter, both in campaigns against the Chevron refinery pollution here and also to protect our last natural headland, Point Mulati, which only makes sense because waterkeepers follow water pollution to the source. They usually find that source is adjacent to a low-income community of color because that's where the polluters could most easily locate themselves in the past. And too often in the present, it still seems that our victories take 20 years to achieve and bad ideas get permitted immediately.
Oh yeah, it's we have the saying of, right, money, power, and influence dictates who gets the short end of the stick on environmental pollution, and so we're gonna help get more power and influence to these communities. And when I was at Hudson River Keeper one time, we sued New York City because they wouldn't respond to a freedom of information request of where the city's water is distributed, because the water in the Catskills is the cleaner water. It's slightly cleaner water as opposed to on the east of the Hudson, where you have Westchester County, Putnam County that have a lot of development sewage treatment plants. And they won't turn them over. So we took them to court, and on the court steps, they finally turned them over before they had to go into court. And you could see the distribution map. All the good water was going to all the wealthy white communities, Upper East Side, Upper West Side, all of the water coming from more heavily developed areas, Harlem, Spanish Harlem, Lower East Side, et cetera. It's everywhere.
As executive director of this organization, do you get to go visit your keepers and get on the water in all these beautiful rivers, estuaries, and oceans often?
A pretty decent amount, yeah. I actually just returned from Sweden, and I've been to Stockholm before a bunch and a little bit further north, but we were up in the Arctic Circle this time, and that was a really cool experience, including having some getting a little salmon and grayling fishing in.
Oh, that sounds nice. Well, looking ahead, what are some of your key priorities and goals in the next couple of years that you'd like to see accomplished?
On the climate and safe energy part, there's a real focus for the foreseeable future on offshore drilling. And I can bring this back to a story that I told, because we talked about how the really, to me, inspiring story of Han Baykeeper and that success they had in a classic David and Goliath type story, right? And cleaning up their community's precious resource.
In Senegal.
And they accomplished all that. And now they're facing a major threat to their waterway and our climate in the form of offshore fossil fuel drilling. And it's a big one too. It's not anything small. It includes some oil majors like BP, Total, Woodside Energy. And you're talking about, they're estimating what could be 1 billion barrels of oil with a B and 40 trillion cubic feet of gas. And you all know that's inconsistent with the pathway needed to limit us to 1.5 and degrees Celsius, and that we need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. But in addition to concerns about climate change, the offshore oil production poses a threat to one of Senegal's most valuable assets, which is its fisheries. And the fishing sector in Senegal is responsible for, it employs 17% of the country's workforce. And it also provides more than 40% of the nation's animal protein. And so now we're working to get together to fight back against that. And we've got a lot of great partners over in Senegal as well as outside of Senegal. And, we've developed a playbook based on work we're doing in the Bahamas on the same thing with offshore drilling. So the Bahamas and Senegal with offshore drilling are going to be a focus for us for the foreseeable future. Also would say PFAS or per and polyfluoroalkyl alkyl substances, which is something that we've been working on for a number of years now. They're a class of more than 9,000 man-made chemicals that were actually invented by accident in the 1930s. But this accident turned out to be very useful because PFAS or PFAS, they repel water, oil, and grease. And so now we have them everywhere, right? They're used to make waterproof jackets, fast food wrappers, carpets, nonstick cookware, pizza boxes, and so forth. And through the manufacture and use and disposal of those products, chemicals have ended up in our waterways everywhere. And the problem is they've been nicknamed forever chemicals because they take more than 1,000 years to degrade. They're increasingly linked to certain types of cancer, liver and kidney disease, immunological problems, reproductive and developmental harm. And now they're in our waterways, they're in our fish. And for most all of us, all of your listeners, all of us here on this podcast, they're in our blood.
So persistent pollutants, offshore oil, which is also a problem in the U.S., thanks to Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who required it as part of our IRA climate bill, and just the many other forms of pollution. And now climate is a threat to healthy and clean waters. So you got some work still set out for you.
Don't forget plastics.
As an understatement, my goodness, I know when you think about all of the challenges we have, freshwater, ocean estuaries, yes, we are very glad that we have so many fantastic waterkeepers. And with that, Marc, we'd like to thank you so much for being on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast. We wish you lots of luck with all of your challenges, and we will be following up. So have a fantastic day, week, and enjoy your wonderful job.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really grateful for you having me on, for inspiring and educating your listeners, and really glad to be here with you both.
Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and myself, Vicki Nichols-Goldstein, with support from Natasha Benjamin and Ellie Kurla. Rising Tide's editing services and technical support is provided by Studio Cape May. The theme song is written and performed by Ethan Kenvarg. You can find Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast, at bluefront.org or download it from Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free, the sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the Blue Frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the Blue Frontier.